All right, Peanut Gallery, take it away.
All right, so I wanted to kind of do this topic for a while now, but I did want to mention that there are a variety of different styles and I guess you want to call it origins of what we know today as professional wrestling. Professional wrestling originally started as an extension of catch wrestling, which is more of that grappling style that you see in that Greco-Roman day and age. It's actually something that was very much akin to what we know as British strong style or bruiserweight sort of wrestling, where the emphasis is not necessarily on the strikes, but it's on kind of the grapples and the transitions between the grappling position and the mat positions.
It was who was the strongest,
Right.
And actually, Toots Mont was the one who popularized what we know as wrestling now,
Right.
Which he called it like some ridiculous thing back in the 30s.
But what I want to go over in this is kind of the cultural expansion and the evolution of what professional wrestling is. So, like I said, we're gonna start at its origin point here with what we know today as catch wrestling. That was professional wrestling way back in the day, the 20s, 30s, all the way up at, even into like the 60s and 70s. That was still the predominant style of what we know as professional wrestling. So in the territories, for example, this was very popular. And the reason for it is because it's seen as the safest, the best one that can be used to script, so to say, endings of matches. So, like I said, a lot of what we know today as professional wrestling kind of is an extension off of what we know as catch wrestling.
Right.
With that, there are a couple of other styles that did originate somewhat independently, but over time, a lot of these styles kind of came together.
Right.
So, what I'm going to go through is that in this day and age, there are four major types of professional wrestling. So we talked about catch wrestling, which is a wrestling style that's still popular in areas where maybe the professional wrestling scene itself is not as developed, say European wrestling promotions, where it's not as developed. Say in North America, for example, where it's a little more developed, or Mexico, where it's more developed, or Japan, where it's more developed. In developing countries, a style of catch wrestling is also very popular. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those offshoots of what catch wrestling has become today, besides just your typical your catch wrestling evolution into a more modern form of grappling and mat work.
Right.
Another popular style that originated, and there is a lot that can be said about Lucha Libre style, whether that is a totally different style of wrestling altogether, or if it took some inspiration from catch wrestling, but adapted more towards an audience where they are looking at the lore. And I did talk about the lore in sorts of Lucha Libre in a past episode, but I kind of want to get an idea of, like, is this kind of catch wrestling with the lucha style because of the culture, or is this a totally independent style of wrestling? In my defense, I think it's I think that there was some inspiration because catch wrestling was kind of a global phenomena, kind of because of the Greco-Roman. But I think that with the Lucha Libre, they wanted to incorporate a lot of the cultural heritage and traditions of family dynasties and that sort of thing.
Well, you see, the difference with Lucha Libre, and I think it's kind of important to realize, because you're right, a lot of the masks and stuff were representations of certain gods, heroes, and whatever. But the reason that the style is so different from everywhere else is because they incorporated traditional performances from battles into it, but that's what derived from the Lucha Libre style.
So there's a lot that can be said about whether or not this is a totally separate tradition that started, or if there was some influence from catch wrestling. But in my opinion, I think that there's enough differences to where it might have started out as something that was kind of independent of it, but it was eventually incorporated into the broader view spectrum of wrestling.
Right.
So with Lucha Libre style, the emphasis is more on the spots, the action, the highlights, so to speak.
The characters.
And like I said, a lot of the flips and dives and stuff like that, that is where the Lucha Libre kind of got its start. So as opposed to the grappling, where you kind of get that blue collar route. With the Mexican tradition, you're going more towards the pageantry, the battles, like you said before.
Right. You're going to more of a mythos than it is with who is better, because I mean, like with the days of like El Santo and the original Blue Demon, it was actually very much scripted, so they were sort of ahead of their time because they wrestled at the same time as Toots.
Right.
So that's kind of what happened there.
Right. The third style that is popular throughout the world is Puroresu, which is the Japanese version.
This one is weird because it incorporates MMA styles into it. Because Antonio Inoki loved MMA.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that too. So with Puroresu, which is the predominant style in Japanese wrestling today, which some people might call strong style, a lot more emphasis is placed on the striking capabilities, which is where we see it in New Japan today. And what makes this a little more distinct from a catch wrestling or a high-flying Lucha Libre style is, in my opinion, it's an extension of the sumo tradition.
Yep.
Where the sumo tradition had a lot of, and we can go way back with what sumo wrestling is, but a lot of that emphasis was placed on the strikes, those maneuvers, because you have to think about what was the goal of a sumo was to make sure that the opponent goes outside of the prescribed
here's the thing about here's the thing about Japanese wrestling. It's not if you can throw the strongest strikes, it's how much you can take as well. So that's why like Katsuyori Shibata would sit there and have people kick him in the back, because it showed that sign of respect. And with sumo, it's very much in that same way. Peanut Gallery's never seen a sumo competition live.
Seen sumo well, I haven't seen it live, but I've
seen it live, and a lot of it is when I was around them, because I was there. It feels like eons ago. But I was with a translator and a friend of mine out there, and he said that they were talking about. This person can take the most punishment.
So it's a combination of strikes and endurance.
Yeah, it's an endurance-based.
Which I think is why New Japan is very well known for its long matches, because it's about that endurance as well as about putting the punishment there. But what makes it, like I said, what makes it distinct is that it's not all about the grappling aspects of it. It's really about the strike and endurance of it. And that's the third style of professional wrestling that we see today. The fourth style is shoot fighting.
Right.
And shoot fighting, most people will associate shoot fighting with mixed martial arts. But mixed martial arts is an offshoot of what wrestling was. Professional wrestling is an offshoot of what boxing was. So it's kind of going full circle.
Right.
Where the emphasis is on strikes, is on making sure that the opponent cannot get back up after the strikes are delivered.
Now, you see, the great thing about MMA is that it takes different forms. So you can go in there as a traditional wrestler, like with Brock Lesnar, who had that NCAA background, or you could be a professional wrestler like a Tank Abbott, but you also have like bare knuckle boxing, and you have the Muay Thais, and you have a bunch of different styles like smashed together into MMA. That's what it is.
Right. So, with that being said, most professional wrestling promotions today will emphasize one of those four styles: catch wrestling, lucha libre, puroresu, or shoot fighting.
Right.
They will take one of those four, and it's not, they're not little boxes, but they are, a lot of them do take one of those forms as their predominant style and their methodology. Now, let me talk about a couple of other forms of of wrestling in general, not even professional wrestling, but there are roots of that within professional wrestling, and I think the most obvious one is freestyle, which is what most high school, college, athletic.
Not in mine. No, that's not right. It's usually Greco-Roman.
So again, a lot of them do have freestyle wrestling as part of their lineup.
The independent leagues would have more of a freestyle, but there's usually very stringent rules when it comes to even amateur wrestling.
And
that's not freeform. That's Greco-Roman.
Right, and you didn't let me finish. Freestyle wrestling is a sort of mixture between catch wrestling and not necessarily surface striking or even, but yeah, there's a Greco-Roman, but with freestyle wrestling, and like I said, a lot of college programs and high school programs might have these as offerings. There are two different styles of wrestling within the amateur circuit.
Yes.
There's catch wrestling.
Well, it's not catch wrestling, it's Greco-Roman.
But it's, again, it is a style of catch wrestling. I'm trying to put it into this little box,
Okay.
into one of those four boxes. Catch wrestling is Greco-Roman with that sort of mentality in there. Does that make sense? So Greco-Roman evolved into what is catch wrestling, because catch wrestling is the most amateurish form of professional wrestling. Now, Greco-Roman wrestling is not professional wrestling.
Right.
But there are professional wrestlers that do use Greco-Roman, which is what is called catch wrestling.
Right, like Chad Gables
Right.
and Otis, who have that background, or Brock Lesnar, Kurt Angle.
So if you want the most similar style of professional wrestling or the most similar style of high school wrestling to professional wrestling, catch wrestling is one of those styles.
It's also known as stretch wrestling.
Right. Or there is freestyle, which I don't think is as common in high schools as it might be in colleges, but especially at the amateur level and in like the Olympics, there's freestyle wrestling.
Yes, there is.
But freestyle wrestling is a little bit different than the catch wrestling is. There's different rules, and that's primarily where it comes in. There are different rules around freestyle wrestling that are not in Greco-Roman wrestling.
Right.
That are not in the catch wrestling. In that there are more moves that are able to be utilized and that sort of thing. Another maybe lesser style or a style of wrestling that is not so much seen in the professional field that we know of today is folk wrestling. And folk wrestling is most similar to what you might know as wrestling, the southern style of wrestling. And folk wrestling is very popular where, again, it's primarily a more rural setting, a more rural sort of area where maybe there isn't an established ring, where maybe there is.
It's more like street fighting,
but
not.
It's not fighting. There's the striking is not there, but it's kind of a who's the strongest guy. So it might be more akin to a territory style of wrestling.
Okay.
Where you go around and you're like
more like a Carney Day
Right.
sort of wrestling.
Exactly, and that is where wrestling comes from, is more of that Carney stuff.
Right, like step right up. Anybody can
Right.
face the defending champion for 15 cents
Right,
or whatever.
exactly, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And folk wrestling did evolve into that southern style wrestling, which is what was missing in the WWE sphere back when they bought out WCW, because WCW still did a lot of that wrestling.
Right.
Where there is like the who's the strongest,
Who's most
step
technically
right up.
skilled.
Exactly.
That's why Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes were there, because obviously they had the charisma to back it up, but also they were very technically good.
Right.
And where it maybe wasn't as script-y, because once again, that whole script-y thing came from Tutamont, who worked for the
Right.
for Capital Wrestling.
Right. And then the last one I want to talk about is surface striking, which is a mixture of catch wrestling and the shoot fighting, where they do the low to the ground sort of style that you see in the collegiate field, but there's more striking allowed. So it's kind of a mixture between
it's
the
like
two.
it's basically Purtarasu or whatever it is.
Pro-Resu
light.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's like
it's about the endurance.
You get some good hard kicks, but at the same time it's not like I'm going to beat you
but
up.
There's an established set of rules that is similar to what catch wrestling is, where you have to know how to win the match, sort of thing. So the reason I bring all this up is again, there are 4 different major styles of wrestling. Most wrestling promotions fall into one of those 4 styles. And then you got 3 others that are not as prevalent, but you kind of see where a lot of wrestlers within individual wrestling promotions might have some of those styles as part of their repertoire.
Right.
And regardless of what wrestling promotion you're in, every single wrestler is going to incorporate these styles. So it's very similar to mixed martial arts, where you have different disciplines of like, okay, well, this person specializes in Muay Thai, this person specializes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So every wrestler comes to the playing field with a different style of wrestling that they incorporate into their skill sets.
Professional wrestling is very similar to MMA in that aspect, but where there is a cooperative effort with wrestling, and I think there's something that is always missing with MMA that professional wrestling has is that pageantry, it's that character. That's why your Ronda Rouseys and Conor McGregor's stand out because they're just not a fighter.
Right.
They're a character.
But before we get to the end here, I do want to kind of pose this question, not only to you, but to the audience, is there are a lot of theories out there that modern-day professional wrestling, something like WWE, even AEW to an extent, Impact Wrestling, they incorporate another style of wrestling. And people might call it the entertainment style. People might call it the sports entertainment style. But when there are TV cameras involved, the wrestlers kind of evolve a very particular set of skills in order to match what is happening on television.
Yeah.
And so the question I want to pose is this style of wrestling, the WWE style, the entertainment style, is this a fifth form of professional wrestling?
Yes. I think that if you go from the indies and you go to something that does have a camera, there's a way that you have to perform that meets that, because it may not be as, you have to be a little bit flashier. It has to be a little more open to where not only the audience can physically see, but the camera at home can.
Right.
There's a way that you cut promos. There's a way that you present yourself as a character.
I'm not talking about the character. I'm talking about the actual wrestling inside the ring.
Well, I think character work is a big part of that, because if you're a heel, you have to do heel tactics, which is part of your character.
But I'm talking like, for example, when we go into when a WWE match starts, do you notice how the wrestlers, they will rotate in a clockwise or counterclockwise way?
Because you get a more performance-based attitude when you are on camera.
But
there is a difference.
But does that constitute, in your opinion, a different style of professional wrestling?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that because I've been to not only Impact Wrestling or WWE live shows, and I've also been on television. They wrestle very differently. There's a much different feel to when it's just a live show, when there's not a camera there, doing it live for an audience, comparison to one that is.
Right.
And I think even within something like a pay-per-view or a regular show, there is even more of a difference from that perspective.
Okay.
So I think there is a style of professional wrestling that some people do cater to in one way or another.
But when it comes to television, there is another. Do you want to call it an entirely different style, or do you want to call it an adaptation of other styles?
I believe it is a totally different style.
Interesting.
And because I've seen wrestlers who were on television for years and years cannot adequately go back to a different style because they have a certain style where they get lost, and vice versa. I've seen, those indie wrestlers try to translate what they did on the circuit that made them so successful to a platform like Impact, to a platform like WWE that have cameras, and it just doesn't work. Okay. It's hard to say what it is, and I think some people do it better than others.
Yeah.
But I think there is a style change. A perfect example is what you have here. Look at Bryan Danielson.
Yeah.
Look at the difference on how he wrestled in 2004, 2005. On the indie circuit, even though Ring of Honor had a television screen, it was more so about the pure wrestling.
Right.
Where then he went to WWE and AEW, it's a lot flashier. It's a lot more about his physical body presence, how he's maneuvering, what he's doing. So that I think there is a difference there, and I think you have to look at, the kicks and the dives look a lot better on television than a stretch or a certain maneuver. He has a little more freedom with AEW, but I still feel like that understanding is there.
Right. Okay. Cool. Well, let me know what you think in the comments, audience, and I kind of want to keep this conversation going because I think it's an interesting question to pose, and I think it's something that we should. I think it's something we should definitely incorporate, into kind of like when you're watching a wrestling match. I think that you should watch out for those little cues and say, oh, this style is here, that style is there, and kind of. See if you can spot those differences.
Right.
So, anyways, that's all I got.
All right, perfect. So when we come back, I'm going to talk about the lesser-known facts about the Royal Rumble, not just the match, but the pay-per-view.